Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel here on the empty throne. I'm Thanos Davelis, Director of Public Affairs at the Hellenic American Leadership Council, and I think we'll dive right in here. I don't think we need to do too many introductions for everybody. We all know each other, and there'll be some bios up on the screen. But for the last 8 decades, there were some standard givens across the world, especially the Western world, that U.S. leadership was a given. And this was true both on military and security, but also the economy and obviously the enforcement, not always in a perfect way, of the international rules-based order. The election of President Trump, however, in 2016, and then again this past November, seemed to be upending these basic assumptions, raising concerns that the U.S. is no longer at the helm or interested in leading the world, thus the empty throne. Ivo, I want to kick off with you. Back during the first Trump administration, you and James wrote a book, The Empty Throne, hence the title here of our event as well, warning about America's abdication of global leadership. It seems the Biden administration made an effort to reverse this, especially when it came to NATO after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Given everything that we've seen since Inauguration Day, from NATO to the international economy and tariffs, is this book more relevant than ever now?
Yeah, copies are available at Amazon. We'll sign them if it is. And we argued at the time, we used a metaphor, we said that leadership is like oxygen. You don't know how important it is until you don't have it. And I think the world is now understanding what it means to lose American leadership. Because what we are seeing implemented in the past 9 weeks is what we warned against, that Donald Trump as a person and his administration now singularly wanted to achieve. Donald Trump doesn't believe in leadership. He never talks about leadership. He believes in winning. Mm-hmm. And winning and leading are very, very different concepts, particularly if you define winning, as Donald Trump does, as I win, you lose. That the only way you win is for someone else to lose. That there is some finite resource, and if I get it, that means you don't. If I have a house, you don't. You may have a little bit of money, but the idea of win-win isn't part of that. And leadership that the United States provided, really starting since the entry into World War II in December 1941, was fundamental to the system that exists, at least in the Western world and since the end of the Cold War globally. The dollar as a reserve currency, the United States military as a security provider, the upholder of universal values and a defender of those when they are attacked, and in so many other ways. And these are now being questioned. And the world is learning what it means to live without the United States as a leadership. It looks very much like the world before the United States led. And this is far more a world of the late 19th and early 20th century than it is the world of the last 80 years. Now, some would argue, and historians of various forms have, that the exception is not what's happening today. The exception was the 80 years in between. But God forbid if we have to learn how bad, how much we will miss that exception, because it turns out it was a pretty good time for a lot of people, whether in Europe or in the Western Hemisphere, or in China, or indeed in Russia, and it was really good for Americans.
James, if the throne is in fact empty, what dangers does this pose for the international rules-based order as we've come to know it, and probably even taken for granted, as Ivo laid out?
Well, I think at its broadest, it means much more uncertainty. It means less security and less prosperity. And to go back to what Ivo just said, I think one has to understand that for Donald Trump, his diagnosis of the situation is that the rules-based order, or what we may call Pax Americana, the American-led order, wasn't something that advanced America's security and prosperity, but was something that created what he calls American carnage. And so he is not interested in refining it. He's interested in disrupting it. Since he's a real estate developer, we'll put it in real estate terms, he's not coming in to say, what I want to do is to remodel things. This is a total gut job, a rebuild from the ground up. And as we have seen in the first 80 days, and it has only been 80 days of a 4-year term, it can be quite disruptive. And I think the challenge, obviously, for America's traditional friends, partners, and allies is how to respond to the very big changes that he has unleashed, both in the economic sphere, which is very clear with this tariff policy that has been rolled out, rolled back, rolled out again, sort of revised on the fly, but I think also his approach to handling the war in Ukraine. And the challenge is that these are going to have consequences that may be far bigger than we anticipate. And I think that the challenge here is most everyone thinks, well, we lived through Trump 1.0, and at the end of it in 2021, the world didn't look that much different than it did when he started in 2017. So it's just a matter of waiting it out, and we'll get to it then, and things will be quite the same. I don't think that's the case. Remember, in Trump 1.0, Trump wasn't sure how to be president. He wasn't expecting to be president. And he surrounded himself with individuals who saw their job as constraining his impulses. Trump 2.0, he now knows how to be president. He's hit the ground running across the board, not just internationally, but domestically. And he's surrounded by people who see their job not as constraining him, but enabling him. And again, we're just 80 days in. There are many more shoes that will drop, and I think some of the consequences may be far different than what the Trump administration anticipates.
Dimitris, to keep us on, the real estate angle that James introduced, as you're watching this gut rehab of the structure that the U.S. has built over the last 80 years from Greece, a country that's invested heavily in the American-led rules-based world order, what does the empty throne mean for Greece?
First of all, thank you very much for having me in the panel. I'm deeply honored to be among such great scholars and analysts to think and talk about something that is so important. I will go a step further, and I will say that it's not only the last 75 years. From the very start of modern Greece, and I refer to the Greek state as it was founded in 1830, Greece was Western-oriented. And in a sense, it was a British-led political project which was handed to the Americans after the Second World War. It's no coincidence that part of that engagement of the US started here with the Truman Doctrine back in 1947. Now, all this seems kind of trivial in details in the New Washington, and I'm sure that most of the people don't even have a clue of what I'm talking about. But the truth of the matter is that this is a country that from the very start was Western-oriented, both strategically and politically. I mean, as a liberal democracy with its ups and downs, but with constitutionalism and parliaments and elections and so on and so forth. So it is a great shock, there is no doubt about it, what is happening the last few weeks, and it's only weeks and not years, for a country such as Greece, which is on the edge, on the very edge of the democratic, prosperous, stable Europe, but bordering a very, very unstable and difficult neighborhood, to say the least. And on top of the geostrategic issue, there is also, and I would want to emphasize and underline and add in our discussion, the domestic issue. Because on top of the realignments and everything else, there is an effort to undercut the democratic politics inside European countries. Germans are today very, very upset. The new Chancellor, Mr. Merz, about the support to the Alternativa that was given before the elections. And so are many others. And if we see that happening. The challenge and the dangers are twofold. It's both the international, but it's also the domestic that we shouldn't underestimate. And everything embodied and epitomized in the famous J.D. Vance speech in Munich just a few weeks ago. So the situation is full of challenges. There are, however, some remedies. One is to do it the way Starmer and Macron have tried to pull Trump on a more sensible, quote-unquote, path. And we are working on it with our allies in Congress, with our allies in the US, with other friends that we have like Israel. To make sure that there is a movement in the right direction and that this is amenable to such a thing. The second is obviously to strengthen the European alternative, and there was some justification in Trump's rationale that we needed a rebalancing, we needed a refashioning, not a demolition, but to renovate our European house and spend more on defense. And then we have to work on the national level with our armed forces, economic rejuvenation, and everything else. But it is definitely a huge challenge for a country like Greece, given how Greece has walked the last 200 years.
Ivo, I want to go back to this comment that you made about Trump's worldview and how he sees the world as win-lose. Either he wins, if he wins, you don't win, right? You lose. With this obviously creates doubt among U.S. allies that who increasingly begin to wonder if they can trust the U.S. As we see that play out, where could this leave the United States?
Not in a great place. The United States is an extraordinarily rich country. It's endowed with a geographic advantage that few other nations, no great powers have ever had, which is that it has, I think, two neighbors that are friendly. They may not think that the U.S. is friendly these days, but in principle, that's been the nature of our relationship with these two countries, at least since the mid-19th century. And two oceans, endowed with extraordinary resources, a rich, innovative population, open to immigration that has propelled the United States to be one of the greatest power in the history of the world. And it has used this power in a very smart, self-interested way to help create an international system. Once it really had the capacity to do that, that would be able to sustain American power and grow it over the long term by warding off competition. The United States, if we were living in the 19th century, and the United States represented a quarter of global GDP and maybe 30% of military power, it would be the most powerful country on earth. However, it would have given an incentive to everyone else to align against it. And that incentive has been undermined by the system that we created. We brought the European Union, the Europeans, our Asian allies, the richest and most powerful countries aside us, into our orbit through fair trade relationships, by strengthening each other's democracies, through security alliances. And that meant that we weren't just a quarter of the world's global power, we were 70% of the world's global power, and therefore we could effectively counter others who wanted to overthrow that world order. China, Russia, even when China and Russia combined. But now, when you start to disintegrate that alliance system because you believe it has been, quote, weaponized against you, which is how Marco Rubio talked about the rules-based order, you are actually incentivizing, and the point was just made, our allies to start to unite against us. And when allies and others start uniting against us, and God forbid, if they start working together with countries like China and Russia against us, or at least China, we're in trouble. We're in big trouble. This tariff regime that we have imposed is incentivizing the rest of the world to reduce its dependence on the United States and to combine economically. It is no accident that Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, didn't go to Washington or even Mexico City, but to Brussels on his first foreign trip, because Canada sees the EU as a means to balance the United States. So 19th century power politics, which we are very familiar with, we know how it has played out, is something that, one, we, the United States, are terrible at because we've never really played it. Because until really World War I, we found that our splendid isolation and non-entanglement in alliances was more than sufficient to be powerful. But two, in a power politics game, when you're not more than half, the others can be more than you. And that's one of the great dangers that is happening.
James, to borrow from a foreign affairs piece you wrote with Evo then, is this realization among allies that maybe, they can't rely on the U.S., they have to U.S.-proof their security and their economies going to be the price to pay for Trump's power politics?
Yes. I mean, for the reasons that Evo just pointed out. I mean, again, the president's diagnosis of the situation is that the United States is in a perilous position, and it's in a perilous position because it has been taken advantage of by its friends, partners, and allies for more than 80 years. Now, I will point out that Donald Trump has been making this argument for at least 40 years. It has been consistent. The only thing that has changed maybe the names of some of the countries. In the 80s, he's particularly focused on Japan, whereas today it might be on Asia. And again, China. As Evo points out, Trump's conception of the world is one of power politics. If I am more powerful than you, then I will get my way if I am willing to apply that power. I am the father of 4 children, and I learned that being more powerful doesn't necessarily having successful outcomes. And I think anyone who's ever had a toddler has learned that lesson quite well. And I think that this gets to the real challenge of sort of the Trump revolution in foreign policy, is that he is about to learn the limits of American power, that others have agency, they have choice. I don't think it's that Europe, for example, is looking to do deals with China, but if the United States takes itself out of the game, or the United States begins to pursue what, from the vantage point of its traditional friends, partners, and allies, are predatory policies, they're going to explore other avenues. And I just sort of close by saying sort of the great virtue of the foreign policy that Evo talked about, that the United States erected after the end of World War II, was this brilliant sort of intuition that there is strength in numbers, or we're better together. And it wasn't that Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower and JFK and the LBJ all the way down constructed this order in a desire of altruism to sort of give things to others, but it was a calculation of raw self-interest for the United States, that we would be much better off if we could create an environment in which people felt that it was better to work with us than against us. And I'll just close by saying, here is where I think Trump has a real insight and actually hasn't measured up to the moment. He has argued, I think quite rightly, that China poses a significant, perhaps even existential threat to the United States. I would argue that, given that, you want to basically build down on sort of the great strength of the United States. It has lots of friends, partners, and allies. And again, as Evo pointed out, if you don't have at least half the power and China doesn't, you're in a pretty weak spot. But rather than bringing people together to sort of confront China or check China's power, the president chose to essentially pick a fight with virtually everyone except for Russia. And I just don't think sort of doing everything everywhere all at once is, under any circumstances, going to be a successful policy.
Dimitri, you're seeing this from inside Europe, and the Europeans have been trying, as we mentioned earlier, to US-proof both their security and their economies. Power obviously abhors a vacuum, and if the US is indeed abdicating this leadership role, who do you see filling that vacuum? Is Europe in a position to do so, at least with regard to its own region?
Theoretically, yes. Europe has a lot of assets. It's a $20 trillion economy. It is the biggest market in the world. It has innovative companies. It has regions that have flourished the last 20, 30 years. Look at Poland. And great success stories like Poland and the rest of former Eastern Europe, and obviously Ireland. And even the South today, in Spain or in Greece, is doing so much better. So despite the declinism, which is very popular among the Republicans these days in Washington, Europe can stand. But unfortunately, it starts from a very low point. The fact of the matter is that Europe has underspent on defense and security the last 30 years. It has huge political challenges ahead in order to unite. And there is the constant undermining from within with the rise of the far right, which is anti-European and divisive. The stronger the far right, the less Europe and united Europe you get. It's as simple as that. Now, I'm not just an analyst, I'm a politician. I have to work on that. And politicians are par excellence optimistic and should be optimistic that the world can become better. That's why we are in politics. Otherwise, we'll go to the university and start fussing and crying and moaning. But we don't have that luxury. Now, going back to what has been said, I think it is very important to be reminded of Thucydides and to read the whole Thucydides, because I feel we only read half of it in international relations. Thucydides spoke of two things, not only why the war happened, which was the upset caused by the rise of Athens, and the fear, the subjective element, not only the objective, but the subjective element that instilled in Sparta and its allies, but which is what most people focus on. But there is a second part of Thucydides. Why did the stronger party lose? And the stronger party in Thucydides' mind, there is no doubt about it, is Athens, the way that it has been described in the funeral address in the end of the first year of the war by Pericles himself. Nevertheless, Athens loses. And the answer Thucydides gives, which is very important and very relevant to us today, is that Athens did not lose from Sparta, it lost from itself. Athens lost because of Athens, because of the degradation of its polity and the decline of its democracy and republic and its ethos, which led to the demagogues and to all the foreign follies, including the Sicilian campaign. And I think this is very relevant for us today. The West is very powerful if it stands united. The biggest threat for the West is not China, as great as it might seem, but it's from within. And the degradation of our own polity and of our own alliance. And I think this is what we are seeing today. Not only, to be fair, on the western side of the Atlantic, but even on the eastern side of the Atlantic, we have similar phenomena, albeit not as strong, because you have a presidential system. Power is concentrated in the hands of the executive, and in Europe, the parliaments can always resurrect themselves, the way that we saw with Liz Truss in 44 days. You don't have that possibility and that luxury. So I think we should work very much on our internal cohesion and things we need to do if we are to listen to the voice of wisdom coming 25 centuries ago from Thucydides in places such as Greece.
Let me, I mean, you're absolutely right, and of course, actually, no one reads Thucydides, which is part of the problem. But if you just want to read one part of it, right, it's the Melian Dialogue, which everybody quotes, including Jim and I in our latest piece in Foreign Affairs, where the strong do as they will and the weak do as they must. But what happens? The strong destroy Melos, literally wipe it from the face of the earth. And it's that cruelty that leads to the ethos, the change in Athens' behavior that ultimately leads to its demise and losing the war. And that lesson, so if you read Thucydides, you don't want to read the whole thing, which you should, by the way, because it's a fantastic book, and it's the best way to understand international politics. Read the dialogue as a means to understanding what's happening. Maybe they should read it in the White House.
And if you are to read it correctly, because the dialogue is not only an exaltation of the strength, the way the people in Washington might read it today. The dialogue shows you that the moment that Athens invokes strength is already weak.
Yes.
The moment that it has to assert its authority and forcefully coerce the Melians, it has lost the game in a sense, because it has been deprived of all the soft power, and the fact that until then, all these people were doing her bidding without Athens needing to enforce it. So the moment that America today is asking and coercing, it is already losing the game, whereas in the past, people wanted to do its bidding by their own volition. I think this is an important aspect that is lost among realists or pseudo-realists and illiterates.
Well, Ivo, is this then something that's reversible? Because we saw the Biden administration, when it came in, it tried to, re-engage NATO, re-engage America's allies. With Trump and many Democrats as well seeing China as the big challenge, is this reversible so that the U.S. can face that threat from China?
So it's going to be very hard. Remember what Biden said in his first address to Congress. He said that he was when he was meeting with leaders, he told them that America's back. And he said, the first question they asked me, for how long?
Yep.
And unfortunately, we now know the answer to that question. And so, once burned, twice shy. The reality is that the world is looking, and the Western world in particular, and Europe, is looking at the United States. And the question I get asked most, including in the last 3 days here, is less what's Trump up to, but has America gone mad? Because he was elected. He won a plurality of the votes. I mean, this one he actually won. He didn't even have to claim that many illegally voted, which is what he tried to do in 2016 when he won. May not be the biggest, largest mandate in history, but that's a different question. And so something fundamental has been lost. Trust. You mentioned it. This system wasn't just built on power. Yes, you needed power. It was built on trust. It was built on the trust that the United States will use that power responsibly. If you are a Greece or a Germany or a Holland or a Denmark, and you had at one point, or maybe even still today, American nuclear weapons on your territory, you trusted that the United States would not use them on your territory. The Japanese have 50,000 American troops. In fact, troops that have been there since the occupation. And when the United States in 49, in Japan, and together with allies in 49 in Germany said, you're sovereign, but we're staying with our troops, they trusted that those troops were there to defend them, not to attack them. So trust was fundamental to the security system. Trust was fundamental to the economic system. That if you do have fair trade, we do fair trade. Bretton Woods was that if I gave you gold, you gave me dollars. Well, that trust broke, but then we we created the system in which the dollar became the reserve currency of the world. That you knew that if you have dollars, it was real. That if you bought treasuries, you would actually get repaid. And in fact, one of the things that is happening is people starting to say, ooh, I'm not sure that that's the case. I'm going to get rid of these treasuries. I need cash, which I can convert into other assets. And so when trust breaks down, the system breaks down, which is what's happened. So even when, and it will be when, the United States comes to its senses and decides that it needs new leadership, that leadership will find it extraordinarily hard to do the one thing that is fundamental to success, which is restoring trust. You know, anybody, not me, but I've been told, when trust breaks down in any relationship, particularly a marriage, restoring trust is extraordinarily difficult and in most cases doesn't work. When the trust is broken, divorce happens. Now that's fine. It's not fine. That's a tragedy for the people involved, but it doesn't have wider consequences for the world. This trust, breaking in this way, will have extraordinary consequences for the rest of the world. And restoring that is a project of decades, not years, certainly not months.
James, as Ivo talked about, the erosion of trust, something that you've been tracking at the Council on Foreign Relations is also the expanding ties between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and concerns over potential axis of autocracies. So as Trump puts America's alliances to the test, erodes this trust, as we said, should we brace for autocrats around the world to begin flexing?
That's a great question, Thanos. I don't think we have to wait for them to begin flexing. They have been flexing their muscles, and obviously we can point to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 as a major change. I have to say that, in the United States, as we sort of look at the growing bilateral cooperation among Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, one title it's given is the axis of autocracies. There are about 20 of them, but another label for it is the axis of upheaval. And I think for many of America's friends, partners, and allies, that may be the more appropriate title. And the United States, with its new policies, actually belongs in that grouping because it is creating a great deal of upheaval around the world. I think that presents really great challenges to America's traditional friends, partners, and allies, particularly in Europe, because things are going to change greatly. I do think that as you look outward, Europeans are, as Dmitry pointed out, looking toward rearming because they've decided that they can't count on the United States, and it is a much more threatening world. But again, you run into this challenge of, is that conviction politically sustainable over time? And because events are going to change, again, when you disrupt things, sometimes you get outcomes you don't anticipate. The Trump administration, or President Trump, when he rolled out his tariffs, was not anticipating that the dollar was going to lose value and the Treasury yields were going to get up. All economic theory said the opposite should happen. It gets back to the issue of trust that is going on. And we could be in a very different position 4 years from now than we are right now. I would also say that, again, when you sort of look at these issues, there's a real challenge for Europe because the question is, if you do wish to rearm, invest in defense, how exactly do you do that when you have a very weak defense industrial base? It's been allowed to atrophy. One argument is, well, you buy things from the United States, but that's a real problem because part of your issue is you're not confident, you don't trust the United States, and that gives Washington more leverage over you in the future. The flip side of it is if you don't, then that may actually fuel the animosity coming out of this White House. So I think that from the point of view of Europe, they're going to have to make some very difficult choices. And again, it's much easier in the case of the United States. You have one person, and I really do mean one person making decisions. But obviously, when we talk about Europe, it's a collection of countries who all have slightly different interests and see the problems slightly differently. And I think it's going to be very, very hard to manage what is going to be a very turbulent time to come.
Dimitri, the Mediterranean is home to a country that many say is veering towards autocracy. Others are saying that it's already there, and that's Turkey. The recent arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu and the crackdown on free speech that has followed is maybe just the latest example of that slide towards authoritarianism. How concerned are you about Turkey on this list of autocracies we mentioned earlier, trying to flex in the region now that the U.S. is abdicating the throne?
Well, I'm very concerned for both reasons. Just to tie it up with what has been said, with the role of America as a stabilizing force in Greek-Turkish relations, and having that in doubt today already creates a lot of anxiety, because in the last 70 so years of Greek-Turkish tensions, we've managed to establish a certain choreography. Whenever there was a crisis, there was American intervention de-escalating the crisis, with the sorrow exception of 1974, when, because of Watergate and other developments, America was not there, and there was a Greek-Turkish war. So in 1964, there was the famous Lyndon Johnson letter to Inonu that averted the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. In 1967, there was Cyrus Vance, as The Economist wrote at the time, Cyrus for Cyprus, all the way to 1996 with Dick Holbrooke intervening during the Irmia crisis. Now, this is in doubt, and being in doubt already destabilizes the situation and creates a lot of anxiety, especially in Athens. But there is also the domestic factor, and it's a factor that I have been studying and dealing, and there are all sorts of conflicting opinions about how big democracies are for world peace. As you know, the realists have always tried to disentangle the tooth, the domestic regime, from the external behavior of states, and the liberals have tried to put it back together. And the truth of the matter is that Greece, at least since Helsinki in 1999, has tried and supported Turkey's Europeanization and democratization as a mean to stabilizing the relationship and having peace in the Aegean and in Cyprus and in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, Turkey is a very special case that most people don't know about it and don't think about it in this way. Turkey has had the longest democratization process in the world in history. It started in 1950 with the first competitive elections, back then when the Kemalists lost to Menderes, and it has been going on for the last 75 years without an end. This makes Turkey a hybrid regime, an in-between regime, where elections do take place, but the liberal guarantees of democracies have been thrown out of the window, and there is constant moving forward and backward and forward and backward. And I think this is even more dangerous than being an autocracy. It is a situation where public opinion plays a role, and populist leaders want to lure it in, but there are no strong institutions to counterbalance these populist, ethno-populist impulses. And as a result, we've seen a certain proclivity, to put it mildly, to militarize conflicts in the Caucasus, in the Middle East, in Cyprus, in Libya, in Somalia, and this is very, very dangerous. For sure, unfortunately, Turkey is not a democracy. According to the Economist Index, it is a hybrid regime. It is becoming more hybrid by the day. It will not be very easy for Erdogan to justify all this, because let me remind you that he came to power and he ruled for 20 years, saying that I am the people, I am authentically representing the people, I'm giving voice to the underprivileged Turks against the elites, the military elites, the Kemalist elites, the state elites, the rich, and now he will have to adopt a certain Putinesque discourse of a sovereign democracy. So it's not going to be a populist democracy, but a sovereign democracy. We will see how he will manage. He has been very charismatic in his dealings, but for sure, regimes that do not treat, and I conclude, that do not treat their citizens right, I wouldn't expect them to treat their neighbors right. And we have seen that time and again with Putin, obviously, in Russia and Ukraine, and now in Turkey. And this is quite dangerous. Thank you very much. You have been an excellent moderator, having made, this is the most difficult part, the right questions, unleashing all the brain power of our esteemed guests from America, and great supporters in that battle we have ahead of us, the battle of our generation, to save that liberal order that has produced so much for so many.
I'll take all the credit here. No, but Ivo, James, Dimitri, thank you very much.
That was excellent.